To another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard, and today we are going to continue our series on Hegel. Yes, 2 days in a row. Let's keep this going, right? Last time we started chapter 2, and here is my summary of sections 111 to 113 of chapter 2, Perception. It says, starting chapter 2, Hegel breaks down how perception works from a metaphysical perspective. He shows us how perceiving things is a sort of dialectic process where we can understand what a thing is by what it is not. This process allows us to create or discover properties that exist within the thing collectively. They do not necessarily depend on one another, yet they are interrelated to the entire thing. They are themselves universals, making up the universal of the thing we are perceiving. Beautiful stuff, right? Let's see what Dr. Sadler says. He says, second portion of the section. Oh, it has a longer title, Perception or the Thing and Deception. Interesting. All right. He says, we start from the point of view of what has been worked out in the previous section, in which it turned out that sense certainty was not an immediate grasp of truth by consciousness, but rather revealed its essence to reside in universals, including the universal of the I, the subject. Perception now takes over this point of view and examines the relationship between perceiving subject and perceived object. The object must be understood as both something sensual and determinate, and as a universal in its own right, but a different sort of universal, a medium, or the thing, which possesses properties. These properties are themselves sensible and universals for perception. They coexist in the thing, in which they are both differentiated from each other and interpenetrate each other, and the relationship between them is the also. I'm not gonna lie, he summarized that way better than me. He broke down a lot of the different elements there and incorporated the last chapter. So I give you that one, Doctor Sadler. You got that one. All right, let's start the next one.
In the relationship which is thus emerged, it is only the character of positive universality that is at first observed and developed. But a further side presents itself, which must also be taken into consideration, to wit, if the many determinate properties were strictly indifferent to one another, if they were simply and solely self-related, they would not be determinate, for they are only determinate insofar as they differentiate themselves from one another and relate themselves to others as to their opposites. Yet, as thus opposed to one another, they cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, which is just as essential to them as negation. The differentiation of the properties, insofar as it is not an indifferent differentiation, but is exclusive, each property negating the others, thus falls outside of this simple medium. And the medium, therefore, is not merely and also an indifferent unity, but is a one as well, a unity which excludes an other. The one is the moment of this simple medium is exclusive, each property, the differentiation of the other, and relate themselves to.
Okay. If the many determinate properties were strictly indifferent to each other, if they were simply and solely self-related, they would not be determinate. So, like, you won't be able to actually be able to define the thing, right? If it was just this one thing or the other thing, or at least not be able to determine what this object really is if you just look at one property or one thing. For they are only determined insofar as they differentiate themselves from one another and relate themselves to others as their opposites, right? So saying, oh, water is different from fire, dry is different from wet, stuff like that. Yet, as they oppose to one another, they cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, which is just as essential to them as negation. The differentiation of the properties, insofar as it's not an indifferent differentiation but is exclusive, each property negating the others. This falls outside of the simple medium, and the medium, therefore, is not merely and is not merely and also an indifferent unity, but as one as well, a unity which excludes another. Yeah. The reason why I want to see in that, because like saying that it's not just that these properties are single individual ones or anything like that, but they come together, right? You can't identify a thing by just saying this one property, right? Or at the same time, these properties are not mutually exclusive to each other, right? They can be combined. So it's an interesting interplay that we are able to identify things, that we're able to perceive things through this conflagration, if I can use that word, of properties of elements and things like that. each property negating the others, meaning that this property, because it's, it's dry, it's wet, or it's dry, it's white, going back to like chalk, these are, okay, it's one. Dry doesn't mean white, right? And white doesn't mean dry, but so they kind of negate each other, but at the same time they're on this own kind of thing, and which allows us to identify with what we mean when we say anything. Interesting stuff.
Medium, an indifferent side of this simple medium, and the medium therefore which excludes an other. The one is the moment of negation. It is itself quite simply a relation of self to self, and it excludes an other, and it is that by which thinghood is determined as a thing. Negation is inherent in a property as a determinateness which is immediately one with the immediacy of being, an immediacy which, through this unity with negation, is universality. As a one, however, the determinateness is set free from this unity with its opposite and exists in and for itself.
Good stuff.
In section 113, we saw that Hegel finished up by talking about what provided the thinghood to the thing. It was this also of the medium that's tying the properties together in some sort of whole. Now in section 114, he's going to talk again about universality and remind ourselves too that each one of these properties can be understood as a universality of some sort. A property like sweetness or being cubical applies to many things. But each of these are a sensuous universality and, in a certain respect, an immediacy as well for the perceiver. And here he's going to focus exclusively on the object of perception, not on the perceiver. That's going to run through this paragraph and the next paragraph, and then we're going to come back to the perceiver in a moment. And we want to see how things are playing themselves out. We got ourselves to a point where we realize that the medium is very important. That's what allows these different properties to exist as themselves in relation to each other, because they can't exist as themselves solely out there in space by themselves independently. Notice too, this is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's worth pointing out, that if we think about traditional metaphysics prior to Hegel, if we use, for example, Locke and Aristotle as examples, Aristotle would talk about substance and then the accidents or the predicates of that substance. So man is a substance, white or red or black or green or whatever you want. Rational, we can have things like good, bad, all those are accidents, all those are predicates. Those are all properties. They're Eigenschaften in the sense that we're talking about here. And what's really much more important is the substance or the subject, the thing that allows them to exist is what they are. For John Locke, in the modern period, we can't really know for most substances what they are in themselves. All we can really know are the properties which we predicate of them. And again, those properties are things that for the most part we take in by the senses, and we have words for them. But what's really allowing them to exist as properties is the substance in which they're in some sort of way supposed to inhere. And it gets a little bit more complicated than that. We have primary and secondary properties. I don't want to get too far into those details. But what's really interesting to see here, what you don't see in Locke and you don't see in Aristotle and you don't see in a lot of previous thinkers, is the idea that it's these properties themselves and their relations to each other that make them what they are. Not just their adherence or inherence in whatever the subject or substance happens to be, but rather something more...
These kids... Sorry about that, y'all. These kids wanted to just run around the house. We got a whole yard, a whole neighborhood. Let's continue.
The level of their relations with each other. So how does Hegel put this? He says that if the many determinate properties were strictly indifferent to each other. So in salt, for example, we've been using that because Hegel likes that example, the whiteness and the cubicality, we'll call it, the having a cubical nature, and the tartness, we could differentiate them all out and say, well, you got your whiteness here, you got your cubicality here, you've got your tartness or saltiness here, and you just put them together in this thing and this also in German auch, and now you get salt. And that seems to be the way that somebody like Locke, for example, thinks about substances and thinks about properties. Hegel says, no, these are differentiating themselves. I put different here just because, I don't want to put differentiate because it's a lot more right, but they're differentiating themselves from each other. I should probably also have done this as well, right? These properties are also in relation in that way. And it's insofar as they differentiate themselves from an other and from an other that they are able to be determinate. They are able to be bestimmt, as Hegel says. They have a sort of reality to them, a sort of describability, you might say. And so he says, if the determinate properties were indifferent to each other, if they were simply and solely self-related, if you could understand them just on their own basis, as universals, then they would not be determinate. They're only determinate insofar as they differentiate from themselves from one another. They relate oneself to their other as what the translator has here, as opposites. The German is actually a little bit more active. When we think about opposites, that's a very passive way to think about it. They are literally entgegengesetzt, which means
like
put down, gesetzt, entgegen, against each other, opposed to each other. They are being, brought into relation as things that don't really go. Now, they are able to coexist in the same thing, as we've seen in previous paragraphs, but they have a kind of agency, you might say, or a relief. They stand out against each other. That's what it means for them to be entgegengesetzt in this sort of situation. So he says, as they're thus opposed to one another, they cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, which is just as essential to them as negation. So what's the medium? The medium so far is this also, this you've got this and this and this and this. The thing allows there to be whiteness and cubicality and tartness and, graininess or whatever else we want to say, about salt dryness. And this is not able to support what's going on down here. So we have an important transition that's going to take place. I just wanted to make the arrow a little bit more distinct. And we move from the also to the one, the eins. He says, the differentiation of the properties, insofar as it's not an indifferent differentiation, but is exclusive, each one of these negating the others, each one of these pushing the others away, falls outside of this simple medium. The also can't keep it all there, bound up together. We have to have something that's got a bit more, you might say, metaphysical depth to it, a little bit more solidity, and that's the one. This is what gives the thingness to the thing, all right? The dingheit for the ding, the thing. So he says, it's not merely an also, but a one as well, a unity which excludes an other. Salt is not chalk, even though they have whiteness and, I guess, dryness in common. They exclude others. And they are a relation to themselves. They exclude others precisely by relating to themselves. Now, this sounds very abstract. What is Hegel talking about here? He's merely stressing that a thing is what it is by being what it is, being in an active way, in such a way as it excludes other things. It says, I am not that. So it's not only negation happening down here at this level, it's also negation happening up here at, you might say, the higher level. And these two interpenetrate each other. So the whiteness of the chalk may not be the same thing as the whiteness of the salt. That's why we can differentiate different whites, right? So he goes on and he says, the one is the moment of negation. It's simply a relation of self to self that excludes another. It's that by which thinghood is determined as a thing. So we're getting away from just thinghood, or thingness, dingheit, to an actual thing. And when we perceive, which is what we're trying to talk about here, do we perceive thingnesses out there, thing-like, entities, or do we perceive actual things? That's where we want to go with this. So he goes on and he's bringing this to a close here, and he says, negation is inherent in a property as a determinateness, which is immediately one with the immediacy of being, an immediacy which, through this unity with negation, is universality. That's how properties can be universals. We're seeing a new side now of what has been discussed previously. So he says, as a one, though, the determinateness is set free from this unity with its opposite. And here he says something really interesting. It exists in and for itself. That's, whenever we see in and for itself, we've got things that have been brought to a kind of close, at least for the moment. Now that we're going to have a lot of development going on after this. But whenever we see in and for itself, we've got kind of Hegelian hiatus, a little step where we can say, aha, what can we survey now? That's what we want to look at as we move into the next paragraph.
So I'm going to go on a little tangent real quick. But this reminds me a lot of well, maybe it's just because I'm getting into it recently, but it sounds to me like, some panpsychist stuff, or, I mean, I know this is not, but because I've been getting into not panpsychism, but animism, which is sort of related in a way, like more ancient to panpsychism. But animism is this, idea that, everything, it has its own kind of spirit, its own life, right? Like even inanimate objects like rocks or something like that could have a life of their own because they embody the spirits of, your ancestors or other things out there or whatever, right? And as a spiritual belief, I find it very interesting and intriguing because it creates a culture where you look at everything for what it is, right? And by that I mean, like, in our current westernized culture, we say we look at things for what it is, but really we only look at things for what we can value of them, right? What we can what the type of value that we can extract for them, right? So when most people look at a rock or a leaf or whatever, they say, okay, it's just a rock, right? But that dismisses the fact that as a rock, right, it has certain properties, right? And it has certain abilities. It has a history, really, right? This rock has probably been alive longer than you, like, well, has been in existence, let's say, right? Um, Longer than us, longer than almost anybody alive, right? Almost every like random rock on the ground. um, and so when you look at things that way, you begin to see that, oh wow, every object, everything out there has its own history, has its own, being, if you will, right? It- and we can easily say, oh, it doesn't matter because we don't we can't say what it's like to be like a rock, right? What it's like to be like any of these things. So we can't really, relate to them. But in certain of those cultures, they were able to do so, or at least able to value, right, more of these different aspects of nature because they were able to appreciate more of those properties, right? And they were able to appreciate more of of what these objects were for, you know, in and of itself, right? Again, and what I mean by that is like when you think about an object in and of itself, what do you actually think about? I think many times, at least here in America and stuff like that in Western areas, um, when we think of an object, we think about what it means to us, what we can use it for. Like, right, when I think of a cup, right, I think about, okay, I use this to drink from. I could put stuff in it and drink from it, and that's pretty much the most use. Maybe I think about it for, the branding or whatever, or the design, right? But it ultimately comes down to what it means for me, right? Same thing for these plants I have. I might think about how pretty it is and how I like to grow things or whatever. So I think about what it means to me. And I'm not going to say there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it does limit, you know, think about the object for what it is in and of itself, right? This cup it doesn't have to be just used to drink water or to drink, anything. I usually put water in it, but to drink things, right? It could be used for any number of things. Or it just doesn't have to be used at all. It could just sit there for, whatever, however long. And that can be its own use, right? That can be its own thing. But in our culture, we're kind of brought up to think about things for what they mean to us. And I think there's something missing there because a lot of objects, a lot of stuff in the world is there regardless of whether or not we're here, right? Granted, this cup is here because we created it, but plants, rocks, many of these things would be here regardless of whether or not we're here. So, you know, their use case, their the what it is to be that object, or what that object is, is much greater than the quote unquote value that we see in that thing. I don't know. Maybe that whole tangent was useless, but I don't know. To me, there's just something there that's very intriguing to think about, and that just brought up, that segment kind of brought that up in my mind. So I don't know. Thank you for sitting with me.
In these moments taken together, the thing as the truth of perception is completed, so far as it is necessary to develop it here. It is, first, an indifferent passive universality, the also of the many properties, or rather matters. Second, negation, equally simple, or the one, which excludes opposite properties. And third, the many properties themselves, the relation of the first two moments, or negation as it relates to the indifferent element, and there it expands into a host of differences. The point of singular individuality in the medium of subsistence radiating forth into plurality. Insofar as these differences belong to the indifferent medium, they are themselves universal, they are related only to themselves and do not affect one another. But insofar as they belong to the negative unity, they are at the same time exclusive of other properties, but they necessarily have this relationship of opposition to properties remote from there also. The sensuous universality, or the immediate unity of being in the negative, is thus a property only when the one and the pure universality are developed from it and differentiated from each other, and when the sensuous universality unites them. It is this relation of the universality as the pure essential moments which, at last, completes the thing.
So basically, things come together in our ability to perceive them in a way, right? Break this down. These moments taken together, the thing as the truth of perception is completed. So far as it is necessary to develop it here, an indifferent passive universality. The also of the many properties are rather matters. B, negation equally simply, or the one which excludes opposite properties. And C, the many properties themselves, the relation of the first two moments, or negation as it relates to the indifferent element and therein expands to a host of differences. I'm telling you, man, the way he writes, goodness. It basically seems like, okay, it takes these different properties, which seem to be mutually exclusive, but it's not. They come together in a interesting way to, create these objects and moments of experiences and things like that, which allows us to, ending of the world, um, or just, objects in general, whatever. Yeah.
From it and differentiated from each other. And when the sensuous universality unites them, it is.
Oh yeah, this part too. Sensuous universality of the immediate being and the negative is thus a property only when the one and the pure universality are developed from it and differentiated from each other, and when the sensuous universality unites them, as this relation of the universality to the pure essential moments, which at least completes the thing. I don't know why it was like I'm looking at the words, but it's not clicking. I know it. I'm pretty sure it's what I was saying before. Sensuous universality or the immediate unity of being in the negative is thus a property only when the one and the pure universality are developed from it and differentiated from each other. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so they go apart. We have this idea of these different pluralities, like these different um multiplicities, going apart. And they come together in our understanding of these things to create like this universal um idea of things, right?
This relation of the universe. Section 115 is tracing out the same movement that was just made in section 114, looking at it from slightly different vantage points and trying to consolidate it. So Hegel is going to talk about three things which your text actually puts as A, B, and C, and we can write them up here in a kind of chart that represents a movement that's taking place, a movement in our own thinking in the metaphysics of objects as well. And I want to point out here that when he's talking about the thing as the truth of perception in English, I suppose too in some other languages that might be where we're using similar cognates, we can lose a little bit of the play on words that's going on, or at least the resonances that are happening, because Hegel is using the same term here. You notice in the German, it's the Wahrnehmung, right? Wahrnehmung is perception. We've talked about this previously. It literally means the taking of the truth of something. And so why is he so concerned with the truth of the thing, or the truth of perception? Because that's what it is to perceive, to take truth, to grasp the thing as what is true, as what is available, as what is there, not as what is wrong, what is false, or something like that. We're going to hit on that a little bit later. So the thing as the truth of perception, there's three moments in this development. You don't want to get too caught up with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing that people want to pigeonhole Hegel into here, because these are all actually tied together. These are three different moments, and this one, the properties, turns out to include a whole plethora of moments. The one also does as well, because the one excludes another. So let's follow out this progression. We begin with the also, and he says that it's an indifferent passive universality. What do we mean by this? So the thing itself is a universality. Let me get away from the salt example for a little bit and just use the piece of chalk again. So we have a thing as a passive universality. This piece of chalk, this piece of chalk, they have the same properties. They're almost the same size, actually. Not exactly the same, but they may look the same to you. They're white, they're chalky, and we shouldn't define things circularly, but you know what I mean. There's a chalkiness to it. They have a kind of sound to them. They're hard, they're dry. All those properties are bound together in this also. That's the medium. These pieces of chalk are a medium in which we find these properties displaying themselves as something true to the perceiver. There's a grasping of the truth. The truth of this is whiteness, is chalkiness, is dryness. So we have that going on. And like he says, that's passive. It's the also of many properties or rather matters. That's a beginning point. And then we move to the one. And when we get to the one, we have real things, not just thingness or thing-likeness, but actual things. This is a one. This is not the same one as this one, even though they're very similar. These are different from each other. They exclude each other. And they don't just exclude each other by the fact that I can't push them both into the same place. They exclude each other in a metaphysical way. So we've got negation coming to the fore there. We have exclusion. And not just at the level of the higher objects, the things that we can see as objects, but also the properties. That's leading us here into the properties. So he says the many properties themselves, the relation of the first two moments. How are the properties the relation of the also and the one? Because those properties are properties for
And of
both the
themselves.
also and for the one, which is the same thing, just being looked at in two different ways by the perceiver. That's a little bit of what Hegel's not telling you that's going on behind the scenes there. And so each of these properties is going to be doing something quite interesting. We begin with the properties, as he says, starting out as in the indifferent element, expanding to a host of differences, a plurality, with a unity becoming a plurality. And he says, insofar as these differences belong to the universal medium themselves, they are themselves universal. So each of these properties is a universal, as we've seen. So like whiteness is a universal. Whiteness is here in the chalk. Whiteness is also here in this chalk as well. Whiteness is in the chalk on the board. Whiteness is all over the place. So is blackness. So is blueness, I suppose. So is corduroyness, as you're watching this, right? How do you know it's corduroy? It makes that weird sound. Anyway, back to the Hegel. That's a little bit of a digression. So as we're moving from looking at the properties from the perspective of the also, where each of the properties is merely related to itself and is a universal, a sensuous universal, and we're moving to the perspective of the one, where now we have exclusion. Now we have something like activity going on. He says, insofar as these differences are just in the universal medium, they don't affect each other, but insofar as they belong to this negative unity of the one, the negative unity that excludes the other, they are at the same time exclusive of other properties. But they necessarily have this relationship of opposition of properties remote from their also. What does that mean? They have they're differentiating from each other, we saw this. But the also was going to let them do whatever they wanted to do, pretty much. It's pretty passive. The properties are also differentiating themselves from the properties found in the other. So this chalk, the whiteness of this chalk, not only differentiates itself from the dryness of the chalk, this chalk, it differentiates itself from the dryness of this chalk and the whiteness of this chalk. That's part of what it means for this exclusion to be going on. And if we follow this out further, which Hegel's not doing here, this other is another one, isn't it? So this entire thing is also contained here, and all of that is happening in that direction as well, with all of the properties involved there. That's a lot to think about, I think. That's kind of a silly thing to say. Anyway, he goes on and he says, the sensuous universality, or the immediate unity of being in the negative, is thus a property only when the one and the pure universality are developed from it and differentiated from each other, and when the sensuous universality unites them. It's this which then at last completes the thing. So in a certain way, properties are not quite yet properties when we're just dealing with this. When we're letting them be what they are, we're in a certain sense more abstract with it. Properties are properties as sensuous universalities, like whiteness, like dryness, precisely by differentiating themselves, by opposing themselves to other properties, and by doing that through the mediation of the one, by not being the one, but at the same time being something that is a component of the one.
Fascinating. I love this.
This, then, is how the thing of perception is constituted, and consciousness is determined as percipient insofar as this thing is its object. It has only to take it, to confine itself to a pure apprehension of it, and what is thus yielded is the true. If consciousness itself did anything in taking what is given, it would by such adding or subtraction alter the truth. Since the object is the true and universal, the self-identical, while consciousness is alterable and unessential, it can happen that consciousness apprehends the object incorrectly and deceives itself. The percipient is aware of the possibility of deception. For in the universality, which is the principle, otherness itself is immediately present for him, though present as what is null and superseded. His criterion of truth is therefore self-identity, and his behavior consists in apprehending the object as self-identical. Since at the same time, diversity is explicitly there for him, it is a connection of the diverse moments of his apprehension to one another. But if a dissimilarity makes itself felt in the course of this comparison, then this is not an untruth of the object, for this is self-identical, but an untruth in perceiving it.
You gotta break that down a little bit, right? All right. If consciousness itself did anything in taking what is given, it will by such adding or subtraction alter the truth. That's interesting right there. Right. So when you just imagine if you perceive something, you change something about that thing. And so it alter with the truth. And this is why like that quantum, kind of science or quantum physics becomes such a lightning rod for a lot of like new age spiritual stuff. Because it sounds very spiritual, right? Like you look at it like when we perceive something or when we measure something, right? It changes that thing. it sounds like craziness, right? But that's just how the world works on that scale. The question is, does this also, does that also work, in the larger scale? And of course, at this time, there was no notion of quantum, physics at that time. It was still Newtonian. They didn't even have relativity. They didn't even have Einstein yet, right? So, um, this is not, of course, related to that at all. But I find it very interesting how there seems to be some of these relations, right? Some of these connections and how we see the world today in our observations and our learnings and stuff like that compared to how philosophers were thinking way back then. And I might add how spiritual folks were thinking even further back before that, because there's a lot of spiritual beliefs that, um, like the ancient Vedish or Vidishkin or whatever of India, or the Hemetics of Africa and stuff like that, or the animists again, which is just Americas and Africa and stuff like that. Uh, like a lot of these people have had a lot of these types of thoughts, right, through time. So I find it interesting how these, not just the broad strokes, but some of these details as well, is able to is able to persist over time and through different ways of thinking, different ways of grasping knowledge. Again, that's a tangent in and of itself. But anyways, since the object is the true and universal, the self-identical, while consciousness is alterable and unessential, it can happen that consciousness apprehends the object incorrectly and deceives itself. Yeah, which we do a lot with all our cognitive biases. Since beings were aware of the possibility of deception for the universe strategy. Yeah, I wonder what he means there. His criterion of truth is therefore self-identity, and his behavior consists in apprehending the object as self-identical, meaning like what it is what it is for it in and of itself, right? Like for basically, reproducibility, right? Can we go back and see the same thing, right? Can this object does this object stay the same if other people look at it, and in that way it kind of self-identifies? I'm not sure if he means that. Since at the same time diversity is explicitly there for him, it is a connection of the diverse moments of his apprehension to one another. But if a dissimilarity makes itself felt in the course of this comparison, then this is not an untruth of the object, for this is the self-identical, but an untruth in perceiving it. Ooh, right. So therefore, like, if something is reproducible, or whatever, if we can see that this thing persists, then when we get something that seems, wrong or incorrect or whatever, it might be how we're perceiving it rather than what it is in and of itself. Again, I might just be translating that wrong, but oops.
If you've been wondering, well, where is the perceiving subject in all of this? We've been looking at the thing and its properties and all this really interesting stuff going on. In section 116, we're bringing back the subject, the perceiving consciousness, into the equation. But notice what's going to happen. I'm going to sort of spell it out right at the start. Anything that's wrong, anything that's untrue, is going to fall entirely on the side of, and in the responsibility of, you might say, consciousness. Anything that's good, real, is all going to be on the side of the object. And when you see something like that, you should immediately say, that's probably not going to last very long. But it is going to last for this paragraph. So let's see how this plays out for Hegel. We've come to the point where now we realize that the thing is the true thing of perception. And perception is true when consciousness, as the subject, is perceiving the thing as it is. It's just perceiving the thing without any sort of blockage or filtering, without any what he's going to call adding or subtracting. We're going to come right back to that in just a moment. But I want to go through some of this terminology. So he says, consciousness is determined as percipient insofar as it has a thing as its object. It only has to take it. It only has to grab onto it. Again, we see that perceiving, wahrnehmen means to grab the true, to hold on to the true, to take the true to oneself. And so what's going to happen in this is, insofar as consciousness is grasping the true that's there, so far as it's replicating the true within itself, you might say, it is getting things right. What is it getting right? Well, it's going to be grasping the thing as a universal, so something that's intelligible, something that it can make sense of, something that it can bring into language, as we've seen, and it's grasping it as self-identical. He says, since the object is the true and universal, the self-identical, while consciousness itself is alterable and unessential, it can happen that consciousness loses track of things and ends up deceiving itself. Why? Because consciousness is actually going to be deceiving itself in a double way here. It wants to grasp the thing or the true in perception as self-identical. That means that, does it relate itself to otherness? No. It sort of dispels otherness from itself. So the thing becomes something that should not be other than what it is. And here we're now in the realm of A equals A, nothing but A, right? Hegel's going to take us away from that in a moment, but he wants to make this as stark as possible. So he says, the criterion of truth becomes self-identity, and behavior, good behavior on the part of consciousness, consists in apprehending the object as self-identical. The piece of chalk is what it is, and that's it. Nothing more. Insofar as I add anything to it, insofar as I take anything away from it, over here, now I'm changing the thing. What does that mean? That means that what I'm doing is incorrect. I'm not getting the thing as it is because I'm not letting the thing be self-identical. I'm trying to push, postulate or push or project my own nonsense onto it, but I'm just an inessential consciousness. I'm just a perceiver. I don't have the dignity of the object, right? And this means that it's possible for consciousness to cause its own deception. Something that we ought to think about as an aside is whether this whole process here, this whole picture that we've got, isn't itself a way that consciousness sometimes deceives itself in modern philosophy and in naive grasp on perception. In any case, we're going to want to, if we're good consciousnesses, don't do any of this, right? Just stick with this. And then we're going to be A-okay. We grasp the truth as such. We don't want to be caught in deception. If we are, it's our own fault. We're the ones who impose that upon ourselves. Like, Descartes says, for example, in his Meditations, when I'm deceived, I can, say that there's some sort of evil deceiver out there, but that evil deceiver can't really deceive me if I actually stick to what I know and don't add or subtract anything. He doesn't use those words, but that's Hegel's terms. So he goes on and he says, the percipient is aware of the possibility of deception. And once you open up the door to possibly being deceived, you know what rabbit hole that turns out to be. And he says, since at the same time diversity is explicitly there for him, it's a connection of diverse moments of his apprehension to one another. If a dissimilarity makes itself felt in the course of this comparison, then this is not an untruth of the object. No, not on the side of the object. The object can be inert. The object can be passive. The object can even be eternal. If there's some sort of difference, if there's some sort of change, if there's some sort of mutability, it must be on the side of the subject. The untruth lies over here. So he says, an untruth in perceiving it. Is this going to be a position that we can continue to
I'll make a prediction here. I think not, because the problem, even with this thought, is that we have no way of knowing if what we're looking at is true or not. That's the whole point, right? We have no way of knowing if we are deceiving ourselves or not, or at least not conclusively, right? There's always more to say. Like when we perceive something today, we might think we're being as unbiased or whatever as possible, or as objective as possible, but then we figure out a new way to perceive, in the future or whatever, or from a different way of knowing, right? And then we say, oh wow, well, we thought we perceived before was wrong, it's actually, this, that, and the other. A great example of this is, again, just physics and stuff, like how when you look at a cup, you think it's a solid object, you can't go through it and everything like that. But when you look with certain instruments, this is mostly vacuum. All right, this is mostly vacuum. This whole sense of solidification, I don't know if that's the word I'm going to use for it, but this sense of being solid is in of itself a sort of deception, right? It's sort of illusion of the electromagnetic fields and how they bounce off of one another and stuff like that. To where most of this is actually full of empty space, right? And maybe when we look in the future, beyond that, we realize, oh no, it's not empty. It's full of some, quantum foam or whatever. I don't know. Or maybe if you look at it from a different perspective in terms of the panpsychists, or the folks who believe consciousness is the most fundamental thing, maybe realize, this cup wants to be a cup, so it's full of a conscious will of some sort, I don't know. But the point here is that we don't actually have a way of 100% knowing for sure if what we see, if what we perceive is accurate, right? We have no way of knowing if we're even deceiving ourselves, right? Sometimes we can discover new things to find that out. Sometimes not, right? Sometimes it doesn't. It could be a whole, type of way of knowing, like a certain, with Newtonian physics, right? We thought we were doing the best there with mechanical, this mechanistic view of the universe, But then came systems thinking, or relativity and all this other stuff. And so we realized that entire branch is like not as accurate. So we can't even use that way of physics for certain use cases or certain, areas of knowledge. Um, yeah, it's just very interesting.
To stick with. Well, we're going to see Hegel's going to move away from this, but we want to see very clearly what this stance consists in. So to sum up where we've gotten to at this point, the thing is the true. Perception, insofar as it participates in truth, insofar as it's grasping truth, has to be consciousness, letting the object be exactly what it is, be self-identical. And insofar as there's anything that's changing or fluctuating or any sort of alterity, any sort of otherness, any sort of opposition going on, that's on the side of consciousness, and that's probably an index of deception that consciousness is carrying out for itself, applying to itself. It's causing its own untruth.
I'm excited to get into the next one. We could do that tomorrow. Continue this series. It's been great though. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you learned. Let me know what you're thinking. And yeah, we'll end it there. Have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.